We are hosting a webinar with Robin Marino, who is a founder of a law firm. And it's very interesting, like when you're joining our channel that is supposed to be about IT management, why we are talking about legal issues. But it appears that when you're working in global environment with international teams, you really should be concerned about legal topics. And today, Robin will help us to investigate this area. Hi, Robin. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the work that you're both doing. And just a little bit of background about the firm. So I founded Global Link Law to help businesses grow and expand into new markets by helping them understand the legal and the regulatory issues to keep them out of trouble and to keep their workforces more productive.
Oh, that's great. So let's start probably talking how those issues might impact the area where managers in IT actually operate and why they should be concerned about that. So I'm working in outsourcing for a while, and I'm meeting clients who want to set up their teams globally or operate globally. And usually, like that might be because of different reasons. They might be looking for best talent, or they want to go with some cost optimization programs. So, what problems there might fail here? Because outsourcing seems to be the area which is on the market for a while, right? And that might be a feeling that everyone already figured out all the problems and that's just go fine. You just go hire teams somewhere in India, let's say, and just work with them.
There's no debate. I mean, a lot of companies are outsourcing now, and a lot of companies, even US ones, have a significant presence in places like India. Companies are under enormous expense pressure to find ways to do things more efficiently and maybe at better costs. But when you outsource, it comes with understanding new laws and of course cultural differences. And sometimes those cultural differences have legal consequences. You might find that what's acceptable in one country might be illegal in another country. So, think about fraud, bribery, and employee issues.
Mhm.
And talking about fraud, just can you a bit elaborate?
Sure. I mean, fraud comes in a lot of different examples, but the classic is the employee who goes and purchases goods at inflated costs and then gets a kickback from a third party or a vendor. So you have an employer that ends up paying for goods that it didn't need or it didn't order and that it never even receives. So the way to think about that, or the way to mitigate that risk, is really to make sure all the purchases go through a formalized or a centralized procurement function, and that when you're buying things, it's going through approved third parties.
Mhm. So it sounds like managers should be approving the purchases of their subordinates, right?
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and it's also interesting that you're saying that there are a lot of cultural things, right? And I think that given that the common goal of outsourcing is often some cost efficiency. So the companies are going to very like cheaper locations from their own operations, and probably the cultural difference is much higher between those locations, right? And that might appear that hiring the cheapest resources, the cheapest vendor, may create even more problems, right? So have you met such scenarios when the employees who were hired for very low wages, they look for some other ways to supplement their income, and what can be the consequences?
Well, sometimes, and you and I have talked about this, right? I mean, you have situations where people are getting hired for a job and then they're passing the job off to a friend, let's say, for example. So the person that you hired doesn't show up for the job. And that's a problem, right? Because it's an unknown person to the company that's now, providing services, that has access to your assets and your systems. And it's a security risk, which could impact your obligations that you have with your clients. So when you think about remote workers in particular, it's a good idea to have them on camera periodically. And remember that the middle managers are going to be your front line of defense here.
Yeah, and I do agree with you that role of the middle management is really important here. And how should someone from middle management deal with the things like overtime or non-standard activities for this particular role in different locations?
It's true, Stan. I mean, middle management, they might have limited knowledge on how to deal with these issues in new work locations. What might have been fairly common in one place could be viewed very negatively in a new location. So, for example, something that's fairly common is giving someone an expanded role, maybe without a promotion or without additional compensation. That can be viewed very negatively. So it's important for middle managers to have those conversations and set the expectations before the offer is extended.
Okay, right. And what else middle management can do in order to understand legalities of the workforce issues in different countries, in new country?
Well, yeah, I mean, they start with making sure that they have access through their company to training, in-depth training, and access to legal advice. They want to make sure that they can also have a good, strong line of communication with HR so that they really get to understand the specific requirements for the work locations that they're overseeing or managing.
It's very interesting that you're mentioning that additional responsibilities can be viewed negatively because, for example, from the culture where we are coming from, it's very often practiced to give first responsibilities, and then if you're like successful in those responsibilities, to give your promotion. So right, so probably the managers will be applying the same approach to their employees who might view this very negatively. And also the question that is interesting for me, so if the harassment on the workplace, like something that we were talking probably about many years ago, right? So is it still a case, especially in IT companies, right? And like, is it covered by some HR legal stakeholders in the organization, or it still should be under control of managers dealing directly with the team?
Wow, that's a big question. So harassment's still a big issue, and discrimination as well. I mean, discrimination comes in many different forms, whether it's religious, gender, or disability, just to name a few different types. And we're still seeing issues with women facing barriers to advancement in the workplace, and they might be represented in leadership roles. When discrimination is in the workplace, it can impact hiring practices, promotions, and how people interact with one another on a daily basis. When the issues aren't addressed, it can lead to so many different things: lawsuits, fines, distrust of leadership, for example, and of course, a downward spiral or turn for the workplace productivity.
Hmm. That's interesting because for me it feels like if a manager is from some culture, so he or she may not recognize even that there is some discrimination or harassment because that might be a common practice in this country, right? So what you are saying is that the company should impose those rules and regulations to managers, right?
Absolutely. Because the thing is, cultural norms and societal attitudes can make it very difficult to change behaviors. A- And what we see in a lot of countries is that even if they have some sort of, reporting mechanism in place, there's a fear of retaliation that stops people from coming forward.
Hmm.
You know, within my career, I've been working a lot with international teams with different cultures across the globe. And actually, yes, this is the significant challenge. And how do you think middle management can address this culture and social barriers?
Well, it's important to have the right leaders in place. You want to have people that are empathetic and that have high emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and what about employers? So, what their roles are here?
Employers have to understand that regulators are looking for the right training, but it goes so much beyond that. It starts at the top. It starts with how things are messaged. They want to make sure that people are trained appropriately, that the policies are put in place and that they're implemented, and that when someone has an opportunity to report something, they need to feel assured that it's confidential, and not that they have to have this fear of retaliation. Because where you have where you have places that don't have whistleblower laws, for example, the fear of retaliation is really big, and it's real. And so what ends up happening is you can tell a regulator, oh, well, we have this channel in place, we have this reporting mechanism. But if the reality is that nobody's using it because they fear that it's not going to be confidential, regulators will see through that.
Mhm. So it sounds like the hotlines that are usually used by companies and advertised in their compliance trainings, right? So they're not really effective, right?
It's the baseline. Hotlines and training are the baseline that regulators are looking for. And unless there's a culture where people feel that they can trust their leaders and that any kind of reporting is going to maintain confidentiality, and
Mhm.
that the right reporting structures are in place, then the hotlines become ineffective. And
Mhm.
like I said, regulators they see hotlines and they see training and they view that as the baseline. They're looking for a deep cultural movement or understanding that these laws are going to be taken seriously and that people should feel comfortable coming forward when they're not being followed, and the policies that the company has put in place as well.
Mhm.
It's very interesting. In your opinion, what can be the effective solution, risk mitigation strategies, and actually, can this risk be mitigated at all?
Right. Well, I mean, it's about having an inclusive environment. You have to be very productive, or proactive, I should say, with implementing these policies, and then making sure that everyone's educated on them, that everyone is trained, the training is followed, making sure that you don't have an option to do the training, right? It's required as part of your job.
Yeah, so usually employees don't like to make such kind of trainings, right? So probably we all face that you have some code of conduct, security trainings, like a lot of them, refreshments. So and probably that might be felt like an obligation, right? But not taken seriously. And
Hmm.
here, probably the question, like this question has two sides, right? So one side is the leadership and management of the company, but the other side is also employees and their rights and obligations. So, uh, how do you feel like do actually employees let's say not generic employees but software developers as we are concerned with IT industry, right? So do
Hmm.
they understand usually that they have rights and also have obligations in this area?
Well, it's about setting the right expectations. It's about, and it comes from the managers. I mean, if if an employee feels like the time that it takes to do their job is filling up 100% of their time, and they couldn't possibly squeeze in additional training, and it doesn't seem like a priority from their manager, then that's not setting the right culture, right, and
Mhm.
expectations. Because the regulators are going to, if there's an issue at a company, the regulators will come in and they will say, okay, show us what training you're doing with your employees. And then they'll say, okay, show us utilization. How are you tracking who's doing it? If you only have, a low percentage of people that are doing the training, if it's not required, if you don't have close to 100%, that's a red flag for these regulators. They're going to pick up on that. And employees sometimes don't understand that because they're dealing with multiple priorities, and
Mhm.
they think that getting the work done, takes precedent over some of these trainings. So, clearly setting forward that it is a job requirement to have the training done, to make sure that people have, or employees have, opportunities to take the training, and that they have a reasonable amount of time, right? Like you can't send the training out 1 week before. You need to give them, amount of weeks so they can plan it into their day. That way the expectation is there, but it's also delivered and implemented in a fair way where, you're setting up your employees for success here.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like there is some formal side of this process, like employees just treated some trainings as a formal things that need to tick the flag engine or checkbox, yeah, and informal they need to believe in this, that this is important, yeah. And are any best practices to handle that issues?
Well, I would say without training, it's really difficult to do this. It starts with training. It starts with implementation of the policies and having that framework in place. One way to go about this is to hire unbiased legal counsel to come in and help set all the policies in place, because then it's coming from an outsider and it's more, it becomes, it less of an obstacle to adopt.
Mm-hmm. So, like for me, it also like Stan mentioned, right? So for me, it sounds like that usually when we talk about some legal requirements, about compliance, about regulators, so it feels like it's something very formal, right? And sometimes we forget what is the sense, like why it is done. So that's done to protect some basic rights of people, right? Like equality, for example. So what you are saying is that, like what I heard, right? So there is a lot of responsibilities put on leadership and setting
Mm-hmm.
up the proper culture, inclusive environment, prioritizing trainings, and not just
Mm-hmm.
to pass those training, but to really understand why they like what is their reason why they stand for, and ensuring compliance mechanism, right? So, and it's not only because you can be fined by some regulators, right? So the reason is wider.
Absolutely. And these issues create, issues with workplace productivity. When, these issues come up, it becomes harder for people to do their job, and you start to lose the ability to have a cohesive workplace where
Mhm.
people are feeling they can be as productive as they want to be because they're not facing some of these challenges in the workplace, for sure. And really it comes down to middle management. I mean, middle management has their eyes on the ground. They have direct line of sight into what's happening, and they become a really important player in how all of this is overseen and implemented.
Mhm.
Looks, there are no doubts that implementing of such risk mitigation measures is quite challengeable process, yes, for the company,
Sure.
right? So,
Sure.
and it's interesting what will be the impact on the company if these measures are not implemented properly.
Well, there's so many things that can happen, right? So we talked about lawsuits, we talked about different regulatory fines, and then also just workplace inefficiencies that come in as a result of people feeling like these issues are, happening and nobody's addressing them.
That's interesting topic. I want like in this like to bring one more question in this area, like bribery. And like it's very tough word, and probably usually like people will say, no, I'm not engaged in this, like it's something very bad, right? But for example, if someone wants to buy a client or an employee a gift, right? So just I
Mhm.
don't know, for the birthday, right? A lot of people don't understand that it can be considered as a bribery.
Absolutely. The thing about bribery is that there are many countries with laws, and sometimes you have to comply, and often they have very wide jurisdiction in terms of how they can stretch. So even if you're a country, if you're in India, for example, if you're, you might be having to comply with the US anti-bribery law. And big companies are tripping up over this. I mean, Coca-Cola, Adidas, $1 billion in fines. This is not something that only, small companies are finding themselves having trouble to comply with. companies at all levels are finding themselves in this sort of web of anti-bribery laws, and can certainly have issues with compliance.
Will it be enough?
Probably not. I mean, there's a company that was hit with a UK bribery law that they put 1.5 billion aside, Glencore. But the thing is with these bribery laws is when one country comes, the rest tend to follow. So now they're looking at investigations and inquiries from the US and Brazil. And so it probably won't be enough.
That's interesting. Like in IT, there are a lot of small companies, like literally, I don't know, dozen of people, right? So for product development. So shall they also be concerned, or these investigations are only for big companies, corporations?
No, I mean, small companies are getting hit too. There's a Swedish company right now that just had to pay 206 million in a number of countries because they got hit with the FCPA violations under the US law.
How did Swedish company come under the FCPA?
The US law is one of these where it has very far reaching. It can reach companies on any corner of the globe.
Oh,
That's interesting. And like how companies can protect themselves. So they potentially can operate with the clients globally, with remote employees globally, right? It's very hard to
Right.
track all the jurisdictions.
Right. And these companies might be subcontractors or vendors of larger companies where not only are they dealing with, compliance because they have to comply themselves, but then they have contractual commitments to the companies that they're providing services to, because compliance, we talked about, the workforce having to comply with anti-bribery, and it impacts your contractors and your vendors as well. So not only are you dealing with these, the potential for lawsuits and fines, but you're also dealing with lawsuits from, your business perspective. You could be providing services for a company that has asked you to comply with these laws, and then as a result, brings a lawsuit against you because they got hit with fines and they want you to indemnify them. So there's all sorts of, different ways that companies have to be thinking about this.
It sounds like a huge impact from some simple gift to a client with all this sequence of the lawsuits.
Yeah,
Yes.
training is really critical, and it has to be training that goes into very specific scenarios. So, it lays out all these situations where people have gotten tripped up, because you don't want any gray area here. You want to make sure that it's crystal clear, that it's very black and white, what is permitted and what's not permitted. You don't want to leave any opportunity for employees to say, oh, it sounds like bribery, but it's not exactly that situation I did in training, so I think I'm okay here. You want to be able to avoid those situations. You want to make it very clear with very concrete, easy to understand examples that are coming up in the workplace. And you also want to take a look at some of the scenarios where companies have gotten into trouble in the past, and make sure that you run those scenarios within your company to see that you are not going to fall to the same issues.
think
Yeah.
twice or even 10 times prior to that.
Yeah,
Right.
probably there is another side of this situation, right? So you don't want your employees and management to be frozen in their decision making just because they don't know is it okay or not, because it can be also the case, right? So if
Yeah.
you have such a huge, I don't know, responsibility on your shoulders and you don't
Mhm.
have enough of knowledge, of legal knowledge, so you may just avoid doing anything.
Well, and that's where having a centralized ethics department really comes into play, because you don't want to leave that decision to your employees. If there's ever a question about whether something is ethical or not, you call your ethics hotline, you call your ethics lawyer, you call your department, and you go and make sure that they run it through, because they're going to see these issues in a different way potentially, and you don't want your employees on the ground to be left with that kind of responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
They need they need support.
that sounds a little bit better, because I'm wondering that during our conversation, so we are actually putting our IT managers, like middle managers, from their
Mhm.
comfort zone because they were educated in completely different sphere about IT, about software development, about
Sure.
probably people management, right? And no of the frameworks is talking that they should be knowing the legal issues and these legal topics and should be concerned about it. So probably that's completely new area for a lot of people, and they will be completely surprised that they should even wonder about that.
Especially middle management. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure. Sure.
yeah. Thank you, Robin. It was a great conversation. Thank you for sharing your experience and expertise with us.
I'm
Thank
happy
you.
to. I mean, what we do is, just real quickly, is we have compliance packages where we put people on the ground. We set up quarterly visits, we have on the ground intelligence, and then we create reporting lines so that these are the things that when you're outsourcing, you're starting to put that framework and that process in place to really have a foundation for compliance for the company and a culture of compliance.
Mhm. It sounds very useful. So I think that
Right.
for a lot of, especially small and medium-sized companies, like such kind of service, it's very important because they just don't know how to do it.
It's true.
Okay, great. Then thank you very much for your time. We were happy to have you here. So see you next time.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you a lot. Bye bye.